Hi everyone, and welcome to week 2 of our course. This week, the content, the information is going to be really concept heavy with a lot of terminology that may be new for you. But this is kind of the meat of the course, are these concepts, and an understanding of these concepts will help you through the rest of the course. So this will probably be one of the longest presentations with the voiceover PowerPoint for the entire course. And like I said, it's heavy on these concepts so that you have an understanding of those, so that you'll have a better understanding of the rest of the procedures and everything we learn through the rest of the course. All right, so our course is Positive Behavioral Supports for Students with Disabilities. So we need a really solid understanding, a solid knowledge of what behavior is before we can talk about how we're going to help our students who have problem behavior. So what is behavior? Behavior is anything a person does. It's a living being's movement in an environment. Behavior is neither good nor bad. It's just what a person does. And this may be kind of a different way of looking at behavior. When I first started in education, when I thought of behavior, I thought of my kiddos who had problem behavior, my behavior kid. But then once I started to study this analysis of human behavior, one of the main points is that behavior is just what anyone does. It's their movements, their actions, neither good nor bad. So of course there are appropriate behaviors that we would want to see our students increase in doing, and then there are also some behaviors that we'd like to see them decrease in doing that might be inappropriate or behaviors of concern or problem behavior. But just to say behavior, it's just anything a person does. So everything we do is behavior. Walking, jumping, drinking, talking. Talking, for example, you can observe and measure that I'm talking. You could time how long I'm talking or count how many words I'm saying. So those are all things that everyone around us could see us doing and observe it as behavior. But also thinking, feeling, and sensing are also behaviors. Those aren't observable to other people, but they're observable to the person experiencing them. So when you think about things, when you're, kind of talking to yourself in your head, that's what thinking is, and that is a behavior. You can kind of be aware of that and observe that, even though someone else can't. So just to keep that in mind, that we're going to talk as we go through the slides how behavior has to be observable and measurable for our purposes, because we can't do much about what's going on inside the student. All we can know is what's happening outside the student, but thinking, what they are thinking and feeling, definitely has an impact on it. So something to keep in mind as we go. Behavior does not occur in a vacuum. We always do things in some sort of environment, and what we do affects the environment in some way. Every one of us from birth have always been in some sort of environment, and things that go on in that environment that just happen naturally affect our behavior, and then what we do affects the environment in some way as well. So in this class, we will be focusing on behaviors targeted for reduction, so the problem behavior. But to do so effectively, we also need to focus on increasing the behaviors we want to see more of, so more of the good behaviors. And through the course, we'll talk about ways to do that. How are we going to decrease the problem behaviors we see in students while also increasing the desirable behaviors we see in our students? So for our purposes, behavior must be two things. It must be observable and measurable. Observable meaning that we can see it, hear it, feel it, or see its product. And measurable meaning that we can count it or time it. So as I mentioned before, this is not to say that behaviors are not occurring within the skin of an individual, such as thinking and feeling. But as educators, we can only observe or measure what's happening in the outside environment, so what we see. Otherwise, we run the risk of making assumptions that may not be accurate, particularly with students who may not have the language skills to effectively express what they are thinking or feeling. So when we're talking about problem behavior in our students, we have to be very careful to say what it is they're doing and not to make assumptions about why. So we can't say, oh, they're doing this because they feel this way, because a lot of times the students we work with have difficulty expressing what they're feeling or thinking. And we don't want to assume anything that might be inaccurate. So we need to go on what is happening in the environment, what we see the student do, and then what happens in the environment after the student engages in the behavior. And that's what we need to go on in moving forward to help make behavior change happen. So in continuing with our basics of behavior, we need to go over the ABCs of behavior. So all behavior follows a few simple rules, which are the ABCs of behavior. A is for antecedent, B is for behavior, and C is for consequence. Antecedent meaning what happens immediately before the behavior, behavior is what the person does, and consequence is what happens in the environment immediately after the behavior. So what happens before or after behavior in the environment, and remember, we are all always in some sort of environment, allows for some prediction of future behavior. So through altering the antecedents and consequences in the environment, we can alter behavior. And keep in mind that, again, we're talking about behavior as anything a person does, good or bad, not just problem behavior. So these are some examples of just everyday, real life, antecedents, behaviors, and consequences to give you an idea of that. So in the first example, the antecedent is something interesting happens in your environment. So what do we all do? The behavior is we look in that direction, and then the consequence is we see the event. Human beings are curious by nature, typically. And so, we see something interesting happen. I mean, if you're driving down the road and you see, flashing lights and sirens on the side, what does everyone do? Everyone looks in that direction. And then the consequence is we see the event that happened. Another consequence is that it slows traffic down, but that's, again, just human nature. And seeing that event reinforces it. And so the next time, similar situation, we're also going to look in that direction to see the event. So another example from school would be that the antecedent, so what's happening in an environment, is the teacher asks a student, what's 2 plus 2? So that was the antecedent. The student says 4, that's their behavior. And then the consequence is the teacher nods and says, yes, 2 plus 2 equals 4. And so that's what happened immediately following the student's response. Another example in the antecedent condition, so we're driving down the road and the traffic light turns red. So something changed in the environment, the light turns red. So what do? We depress the brake pedal. That's our behavior. And the consequence is the car stops. So again, in that environment, traffic light turns red, that's the antecedent. Behavior, we depress the brake pedal, and then the consequence in the environment is that the car stops. Another example is there's a spoon on the table. That's an antecedent. We see a spoon on the table. Behaviors reach toward it, and the consequence is that we're touching the spoon. And that changes the environment in some way because now I'm holding the spoon. And these behaviors can be broken down into very, very minute antecedents, behaviors, and consequences, and also larger ones, depending on how you're looking at the situation. All right, so here are some more examples of the ABCs of behavior, and these are more focused on the educational setting. So in the first example, in the antecedent condition, an instruction is given to line up. So the teacher says line up, and the behavior is a child screams no, and the consequence is the child is told to go to timeout. Another example in the antecedent condition would be that the child wants the teacher's attention. So their behavior is that the child scratches the teacher. And then the consequence is that the child is verbally reprimanded by the teacher. Another example in the antecedent condition is that the instruction is given to line up. This time the behavior is that the child readily follows the direction. And the consequence is the teacher delivers a fist bump and praise. Good job lining up. And then our last example in the antecedent condition is the child wants the teacher's attention. The behavior is that the child raises her hand, and then the consequence is the teacher praises the student for raising her hand and calls on her and gives her the attention. So you can see how these analysis of behavior with the ABCs, antecedent, behavior, and consequence, can happen across anything we do, everyday life, school life, anything we do. Okay, so this is our first active student responding question, or ASR. And so remember, you can write your answer down on a piece of paper with pencil or pen, or in a Word document, and then either take a picture of it or just upload it if it's a Word document to submit the assignment. And the answer is on the next slide, but this is again just to make sure you're paying attention and understanding the concepts. So which of the following would not be considered an observable or measurable behavior? A, getting angry, B, hitting, C, yelling, D, kicking the wall. So again, to be observable and measurable, we would have to be able to see it in some way, measure it, meaning count how many times it happened, or time it for how long it happened. So go ahead and think about that and write down your answer. And the correct answer is A, getting angry. That would not be considered an observable or measurable behavior. You could look at a person who's actually smiling and they could be feeling really angry. So again, that's something we really can't know if they're feeling angry or not. All we can go by is what we see, what we observe and measure. Hitting, yelling, and let me see what the previous one was, kicking the wall, can all be observed in some way. I can see someone hit someone else. I can hear the yelling. I can time how long the scream lasted, or I can count how many words were yelled. So those are things that are all observable or measurable. So ASR number 2, the A in ABC analysis stands for A, analysis, B, analog, C, antecedent, or D, assessment. And the correct answer is C, antecedent. The A in ABC analysis stands for antecedent, what happens immediately before a behavior. So now we're going to talk about things or variables that affect our behavior. So our physiology, our makeup, our genes, the brain, body, hormones, etc., that all definitely can affect our behavior. Those are all variables that can affect our behavior. Also, our culture. So what other people around us value and respond to, that can also affect our behavior. And our own history of doing things and how things change as a result of what we do. This is our learning history, and that also will affect behavior. And none of these variables work in isolation. They all kind of work together to affect behavior and to determine what people do and why they do it. So of those three things, those variables we talked about on the last slide, the physiological variables may set the stage for certain behaviors to be more likely. But most of us can't do much about our physiology, our genetic makeup. Medical issues, if there are any, should be addressed carefully by medical providers. So if they're in one of our students, if we do suspect there is something medical going on, we would definitely want to, talk to the parents about that. As educators, we can't do anything about any medical needs. And the culture changes at a relatively slow pace. So short of moving to and adopting a new culture, there's again not much you can do about this as educators. So as educators, we are concerned with problem behavior that is happening in our classrooms. And what we can control is that immediate environment. We can control that classroom environment, even though we have little control over physiological variables or cultural variables. What we can control is that classroom environment. So that leads us into causes of behavior. We behave or do things to change our immediate world or our immediate environment, what's going on in our surroundings. How things change as a result of what we do make it more or less likely that we will do the same thing in the future. So when things get better for us, we do what happened just before more often, and if things get worse for us, we do whatever we did just before less often. So again, just to recap, we're always in an environment, and if we do something and that immediate environment gets better because of something we did, we're more likely in the future to do the same thing. If however we behave in some way or do something and something in the environment changes and makes it worse for us, we're not going to do that same thing again. Perfect example of this is, touching a hot stove. Behaviors touching the hot stove, that makes it really bad for us in our environment. We get burned. So are we likely to touch that hot stove again in the future? No. So that's just an example of how that works. So some things to keep in mind. We want to be very careful not to blame the student who is engaging in problem behavior. It's really hard to do, but we have to really be careful not to do that. Children and students do what they know. They just do what they have learned to do. We all do what works for us, what contacts reinforcement. We'll cover reinforcement later, but we all do what works for us, that benefits us. What works for us is determined by a relationship between what we do and how the world or the environment responds. And just as we have to be careful not to blame the student engaging in problem behavior, we have to be very careful not to blame ourselves. It can be very frustrating for us in dealing with students engaging in problem behavior, especially severe problem behavior. But, we have to be careful not to blame ourselves either. There are many factors that affect behavior. We just do what we know, what we have learned. Working to solve problems involves caring deeply enough to do something different and remaining calm enough to be objective. So some important things to keep in mind. So here are some problem behaviors that you may have seen or will see in the classroom environment. Aggression toward others, self-injurious behaviors, property destruction, tantruming, bolting, eloping from areas, climbing, solitude from others, so refusing to interact with others, non-compliance, self-stimulatory behaviors, and vocal outbursts. So again, just some behaviors you may end up seeing, and these are some of them are kind of vague. So when we say like aggression toward others or self-injurious behaviors, keep in mind when we talk about behavior being observable and measurable, and we're going to get into this more in depth, when we are collecting data on problem behavior or reporting to parents or other school personnel in reports about the behavior, if we write, for example, aggression toward others or talk about it, we need to be very specific about what those behaviors look like so that they're observable and measurable. So it would be something like aggression toward others in the form of punching a peer when the peer approaches. So see how you can make that very observable and measurable instead of just more vague aggression toward others. Or for example, self-injurious behaviors, you might say, forcefully hitting self on the chin with the heel of their hand. So again, whenever we're doing report writing about these behaviors or in talking with team members or parents, we want to describe exactly what the student is doing so that everyone is on the same page. Okay, so you're in the classroom, you're a teacher, and a student or students are engaging in behaviors of concern or problem behavior. So your first step is to describe the behavior in observable and measurable terms. In order to do something about the behavior, we first must describe it, and like I said, very specific. So we need clear descriptions with examples, and these are important so that when we collect data on the behavior, we know what to look for and what to count. And also, like I said before, for when we're talking at team meetings or writing our reports, it's very specific, the behavior is described. So examples of behavior described in observable and measurable terms. Student demonstrates property destruction in the form of throwing instructional materials and knocking over classroom furniture. Another example, student demonstrates non-compliance in the form of vocal refusals, laying his head and his arms on his desk, and or closing his eyes. So each of these behaviors can be directly observed, counted, and or timed. So you see how you have to list very specifically what you're collecting data on and what you're looking for. If you just say non-compliance, that could look like a lot of different things. So be very careful to be very specific and descriptive when you're talking about problem behavior. And here are some non-examples of behavior descriptions. Student shows frustration, student is aggressive. So again, how do we really know that they're frustrated? We don't unless they can really explain that. And a lot of times they may say that they are, even if they're not. So we can't really go on that. And also the aggressive, I mean, yes, we can call some behaviors aggressive, but it's more important to specifically describe and take data on what are the specific behaviors. All right, so our first step was to define or describe the behaviors in observable and measurable terms, very specific. So once we know what we're looking at, what we're counting or measuring, next we need to figure out, why is the student doing this? What function does that problem behavior serve? And then we can help make behavior changes. So why is using the science of applied behavior analysis, or ABA, in the classroom effective? Analyzing behavior by function leads directly to a reliable intervention, not an unchangeable internal cause. So here's an example that we would not want to see. Tom has an emotional disorder. He punches and kicks his teacher because he feels angry. So if we want to come up with an intervention for that, we can't do much about his feelings of anger. So let's look at the next example, versus Tom punches and kicks his teacher whenever she gives him work to do, and his teacher then puts him in timeout. He punches and kicks his teacher to escape the work that she gives him. So if we're looking at his punching and kicking from an applied behavior analysis perspective, so really looking at what is the function, why is he engaging in this problem behavior, then we can do something about it by changing the environment, and we can affect that behavior. Here are the critical variables that influence behavior. So back to those ABCs, antecedent, behavior, and consequence. And again, an analysis of this helps us determine the function. Why is the student engaging in this problem behavior? They're doing it in some way to make their world better. Maybe it's to escape something they don't want to do. Maybe it's to gain access to something they want or need. So that's kind of our job. Like I said, first step was defining the problem behavior in observable and measurable terms. And then the next step is analyzing it based on these ABCs, antecedent, behavior, and consequence, to determine why the student is engaging in the problem behavior, or to determine its function. So very important, the environmental variables that affect behavior the most are the ones that occur immediately before and immediately after the behavior. So in the antecedent condition, something in the environment that happens immediately before a behavior, or the trigger for the behavior, and then the behavior happens, it's what the person does, and then the consequence that matters most is something in the environment that happens immediately after behavior, and that'll help us determine the function of the behavior, why they're engaging in that behavior. All right, so it's time for our ASR 3. The environmental variables that affect behavior the most are the ones that occur: A, in the morning before school; B, immediately before and immediately after the behavior; C, at the end of the day; or D, at home. And the answer is B. Those that occur immediately before and immediately after the behavior are the ones that affect behavior the most. So some more info about antecedents, the A of the ABC analysis. And again, antecedents are what happens immediately before a behavior. So some common antecedents for problem behaviors in schools are: the teacher gives an instruction or a demand; the student is alone or not engaged; the teacher removes a preferred item from the student or takes the student away from a preferred activity; the teacher interrupts the student to transition to another activity; the student asks for an item or activity and the teacher says no, or that they have to wait; and the student wants or needs an item or activity but cannot access it on his own, so they have trouble asking for it appropriately. So the previous slide gave examples of very common antecedents that trigger problem behavior, and again, those happen immediately before the problem behavior. There are other events that we call setting events that are antecedent conditions, but they do not occur immediately before the behavior. They would occur at some time before the behavior, but not that immediate trigger. They might increase the likelihood or intensity of behavior. They include illness, fatigue, medication changes, prior stressful events. Setting events are not the causes of behavior in and of themselves. Very important to remember. They can make it more likely that the student will engage in problem behavior, but they're not that trigger. There's something else in the environment that triggers it, such as a demand being placed on the student, or the student wanting something but they're not allowed to have it. So keep that in mind. So this is a false statement. Tom punches and kicks his teacher because he is sick. This is a true statement. Tom is more likely to punch and kick his teacher when he is sick, but only when she gives him work to do. So if Tom's not feeling well and he comes into school and he can do whatever he wants all day and play on the iPad and watch his favorite movie, he's not likely to punch or kick his teacher even though he's sick. So keep that in mind. He might be more likely to punch or kick her because he's not feeling well, but only after she asks him to do something he doesn't want to do. All right, so some more information about behaviors, the B of the ABC analysis. And again, behavior is what a person does or says. Behavior is the movement of a person in his or her environment. And behavior is described by its physical characteristics or what it looks like. It is defined in observable and measurable terms. And again, we already talked about this, but just to stress the point, if you're going to say aggressions, you want to be specific, punching and kicking the teacher. If you can't directly observe it and measure it, it is not behavior. So some examples. Charlie pushed the button on the game. Can you observe it? Can you measure it? Yes, I can watch him take his finger and press the button. And I can also see that something changes on the screen of the game. So there's like a product that changed as a result of him pressing the button. Versus Charlie was frustrated with the game. Can you observe it or measure it? You can't really observe or measure frustration. So again, children with advanced language repertoires and can also engage in thinking, so that covert behavior that we can't see, definitely is behavior, and we realize this. But thinking can't be directly observed, or their feelings can't be directly observed or measured, so we have to be very careful, once again, not to assume what they're thinking or feeling. All we can go on is what we see or what they tell us. All right, so now more on the consequences, the C of the ABC analysis. And we're going to get into some technical terms, and these were very confusing for me when I first started learning about this. So just try to pay close attention, and if you need to go back and review it a few times, that might be helpful to do so. So when we talk about the consequence condition, reinforcement is something that happens in the consequence condition. And reinforcement is a consequence that increases the future probability or the future chance of that behavior happening again. Reinforcement is the function of the behavior. And there are two types of reinforcement. There's positive reinforcement and there's negative reinforcement. And when I first started learning this, I got really confused because I always thought of negative as bad, more like a punishment or, giving them reprimands. So we really want to think about it in different ways. So positive reinforcement is a consequence. So it's providing something to the person that makes the behavior occur more often. It's adding something to the environment. It's giving something. I want you to think of it in math terms, like adding. So an example would be giving a child $20 after mowing the lawn might make the child mow the lawn again in the future. So that would be positive reinforcement. The $20 was added to his environment, and it makes it more likely that he's going to mow the lawn again in the future. Negative reinforcement. It still increases the future chance of a behavior happening again, but it does so by removing something from the person that makes the behavior occur more often. So again, think about it in math terms. Positive plus, you're adding something to the environment. Negative minus, you're removing, subtracting, taking something away from the environment. But it still makes that behavior more likely to happen again in the future. So here's an example. The removal of pain after taking medicine might make a person take medicine again in the future. That is an example of negative reinforcement. So I'm going to go over this a couple more times. Negative reinforcement. There's something aversive or not good happening in your environment. You do something, and then that aversive or the thing that's not good goes away. It's taken away, subtracted. Things get better for you, and then you're more likely to still engage in that behavior again in the future. So here are some examples in the classroom. So positive reinforcement might be that, a student is working really, really well on their math paper, and they get, a reward, they've earning tokens through it, and they might get, a little bit of break time to play on the iPad after they finish their math paper. If that makes it more likely that they do their work again in the future, that is positive reinforcement. The iPad or those tokens that they earned were added to the environment, and it makes it more likely they're going to complete the math worksheet again in the future. Versus there's a student who's presented with a math paper, for example, and they say no and rip up the paper and throw the pieces on the floor. Then they are given timeout. That actually may be negatively reinforcing the problem behavior, meaning something bad was happening for that student in their environment. They were presented with a math worksheet that they didn't want to do. That's an aversive. It's not good for them. So they engaged in some sort of behavior, in this case, ripping up the paper and throwing it on the floor. The consequence was that task, that demand was removed. They were placed in timeout. They didn't have to complete the work. That could actually make it more likely that they're going to rip the paper, say no, throw the paper on the floor again in the future, because it was actually negatively reinforced. Something was removed, they got to go to timeout, and they're going to do that again in the future. So very important to keep those concepts in mind when we're looking at problem behavior. Okay, so again, because this is confusing, positive and negative reinforcement. If it's reinforcing to a student or any person, if something is a reinforcer, if it's reinforcement, it's going to make that behavior more likely to occur again in the future. It can be positive or negative reinforcement. Positive is adding something that increases the behavior. Negative reinforcement is removing something, but it still increases the behavior. So again, this kind of goes against our typical vocabulary where negative means bad. In behavioral terms, the negative means subtract. Something is removed, something is taken away. All right, so our ASR number 4 question, and remember to be writing your answers down. A consequence that increases the future probability of a behavior by adding something to the environment is A, positive reinforcement, B, positive punishment, C, negative reinforcement, or D, a reward. And the answer is A, positive reinforcement. It's a consequence that increases the future chance of that behavior happening again by adding something to the environment. ASR number 5, when the consequence negative reinforcement follows a behavior, it does what to the future chance of that behavior happening again? It decreases the chance of the behavior occurring again. B, has no effect on the behavior. C, punishes the behavior. D, increases the chance of the behavior occurring again. And the answer is D. It increases the chance of the behavior occurring again by removing an aversive from the environment. Okay, so now that we have defined what reinforcement is, it's anything that follows any behavior. It's a consequence, so anything that follows behavior that increases the chance of that behavior happening again is by definition reinforcement. So we're going to look at some myths and facts. So the first myth is that reinforcement is bribery. That is incorrect. The fact is that reinforcement is a process. Reinforcers are the events, items that reliably increase the future probability of behavior occurring again. Anything can be a reinforcer. It's very individualized depending on the person, each individual person. What's reinforcing to them could be totally different than what's reinforcing to another person. So another myth is that reinforcement equals candy and toys, and that is incorrect. And the fact is that praise, attention, stickers, candy, high five, toys, recess time, headbanging, adrenaline, reprimands, timeout, spanking, etc. could all be reinforcers or serve as reinforcement. So again, very, very important. This is why we use this ABC analysis. What is the person doing? what happens right after that problem behavior. Whatever's happening right after that problem behavior is probably reinforcing it if we're continuing to see the behavior happening over and over again. So if reinforcement, when it follows behavior, always increases the chance of that behavior happening again in the future, what decreases the chance of a behavior happening again in the future? Well, that is punishment. So another consequence is punishment, and it's a consequence that decreases the future probability of behavior. So just like with reinforcement, there are two types of punishment. There's positive punishment and there's negative punishment. So again, this is confusing because it goes against our typical vocabulary with these terms. So positive punishment, think about adding, is providing something to the person that makes the behavior occur less often, but it's still something is given, added to the environment, and it makes that behavior occur less often in the future. For example, a stomach ache after a person eats a box of chocolates might make that person eat less chocolate in the future. So the stomach ache is added to your environment, to your internal environment. It's something that's been added following you eating an entire box of chocolates. If that makes it less likely that you eat an entire box of chocolates again in the future, then that stomach ache served as a positive punisher. It decreases the chance of that behavior happening again. Negative punishment. So again, it's going to decrease the chance of a behavior happening again, but just like with negative reinforcement, it does so by removing something or taking something away that makes the behavior occur less often. For example, losing cell phone privileges after coming home late might make a teenager come home late less frequently in the future. So their behavior is they come home late after their curfew. The consequence is that their cell phone is taken away. If that serves to decrease them coming home late again in the future, then that was a negative punishment. Something was removed and it decreased the behavior. Right, so some myths and facts about punishment. So myth, punishment equals timeout and spanking. Fact, punishment is a process, just like reinforcement is a process. Punishers are the events or items that reliably decrease the future probability of behavior. Anything can be a punisher. Praise, attention, stickers, candy, high five, toys, recess time, headbanging, adrenaline, reprimands, timeout, spanking, etc. can all be punishers. And if you remember, that's the exact same list that could be potential reinforcers for a student. Every child, every student, every person is different, and what's reinforcing to one could be punishing to another. So to determine what is serving as a reinforcer or a punisher, we have to really look at that ABC analysis. What's happening immediately before a behavior, what the behavior is, and what's happening in the environment immediately after the behavior. And that'll help us determine what are functioning as reinforcers and punishers. Another myth is that punishment is a quick and easy solution to decreasing behavior. But the fact is that punishment is laborious and has many negative side effects. For punishment to be effective, it has to occur every single time the behavior occurs. You also risk pairing the teacher as being an aversive, which we don't really want. We want the students to like us. We want to, we want them to be paired well with us. And we also risk modeling undesirable behavior. Now, that being said, punishment occurs as a naturally occurring consequence, to all of us in our everyday life. The example, again, of touching the hot stove, and that's a positive punisher. Pain was added to your environment when you touched a hot stove. That makes it less likely that you're going to engage in that behavior again in the future. And so that punished your behavior. So like I said, it happens every day. We typically avoid trying to use a lot of punishment in behavior plans when we're working with our kiddos with problem behavior in school. And that's for a number of reasons. Some listed there that, it's more laborious actually. You risk pairing the teacher as an aversive. Some other reasons not to do that is that oftentimes only one person delivers the punishment, and then the student learns to be good in the presence of the punisher. But they don't really learn to be good in all environments and learn what to do appropriately all of the time. They only know how to avoid the punishment in the presence of the person who delivers the punishment. And that's really not our goal. Our goal is to teach them how to appropriately behave and interact with people across all environments. So that's one reason why we avoid it. An example from everyday life that I like to give is, the state police work on the system of punishment for speeding, and they have to. But think about it. When is the only time that all of us never ever speed? It's pretty much when we know that there's a police officer sitting along the road. Now, if the police officers worked on a system of positive reinforcement, which every time they caught us going the speed limit, they gave us $100, we would all always go the speed limit because we get that positive reinforcement for going the speed limit. So that's a perfect example of our own behavior, how we'll engage in the appropriate behavior, oftentimes only in the presence of the police officer along the side of the road, or if there's a risk of the police officer along the road to catch us speeding. And a lot of other times we will speed anyway. So, of course, the police officers can't work on a positive reinforcement system. They don't have the funds to give everyone $100 when they catch us going the speed limit. But if they could, it would definitely work. And that's what we want to do with our students, is we want to use positive reinforcement when they are doing what they should be doing. That's going to increase that behavior versus trying to punish the bad behavior or inappropriate behavior. So you're probably wondering, well, if we want to avoid punishment in our behavior plans in our classrooms as much as possible, what can we do to decrease problem behavior? Well, there's another part of the consequence condition, and that's called extinction. An extinction is a consequence that occurs when reinforcement is stopped, and then it stops the behavior fades away. So if there's a behavior happening and it's been previously reinforced somehow and it keeps happening, if we stop reinforcing that behavior goes on extinction and will fade away. So the effects of extinction last longer than punishment, and they also occur without the negative side effects, such as pairing the aversives and modeling undesirable behavior. Now, it's important to keep in mind that sometimes when you are putting extinction into place, you might see this, what we call an extinction burst. And this means that the behavior will get worse before it gets better. And this happens to all of us in everyday life. Example, the TV channel is when you're using a remote control and the TV channel changes after you push a button on the remote, it's going to keep you pressing the same button on the remote. So it's been reinforced. When I press the button on the remote control, the TV changes, the channel changes. That's reinforcing to me because I want the channel to change. So I keep doing that in the future. But what happens if you go to push the button on the remote control and the TV channel doesn't change? Well, we push the button a few more times. Then we might press harder on the button. We might shake the remote or, bang it on our other hand. And how long do we continue to do that with the remote before we finally put it down and just go get a new battery? So that little pushing the button harder, more times, tapping the remote on our hand, that is all an extinction burst. So we had been reinforced in the past for pressing the button on the remote, and suddenly reinforcement stops. We are going to engage in some other changes in behavior, some little variations there, maybe press the button harder, so make it a little more, severe behavior that we're doing. But then we finally just stop, put the remote down, and, go get the battery. So it does get placed on extinction. So the same things happens with our students. So a lot of times, let's say, for example, that we have a student who's engaging in problem behavior, and we've determined that the function is to escape doing a math worksheet. I always use this example, but it's a good one. So if in their past they rip up the paper, throw it on the floor, they get reinforced. Remember, negative reinforcement by going to timeout. So that task has been removed. They're actually negative reinforced. They know, oh, if I rip up the paper, I just get to go sit in timeout and I don't have to do this right now. So if then we decide, okay, you know what, we're going to put that on extinction. We're no longer going to reinforce that problem behavior. So we set the math paper down there and they go to rip it up and we hold the paper down and we just keep on the demand. Do the first problem, and we're holding the paper down. We are probably going to see some spikes and changes in behavior, that extinction burst. You might see some new behaviors like kicking, trying to break their pencil, yelling, doing some other things. And oftentimes teachers will say, well, I tried extinction and it just got so bad and we couldn't deal with it. It made the problem behavior worse. That does happen. And in many cases, and we'll explain this as we go, in most cases, we actually want to stick with it because it will get better after that extinction burst happens. They will learn, oh, I'm not going to get away with doing this. I just need to do the math worksheet. Now, important caveat to that. We are going to work on preventing that problem behavior from happening in the first place. So what can we do so that they don't even want to engage in problem behavior? That is vital and very important, and we're going to focus heavily on that. But keep in mind that we are going to put in these, extinction into our intervention so that previously reinforced behavior is no longer reinforced. So it's an important concept to understand. So in the previous slide, when I talked about, the extinction burst and how, problem behavior might get worse before it gets better when we're placing it on extinction, we also know that there are definitely times where problem behavior can be so severe that the safety of the student or others is at risk. And then we wouldn't run those extinction procedures. So we definitely keep that in mind, and we'll get into that down the road when we talk about specific behavior plans for students. But right now we're just talking about what the concepts are and what the terms mean. So here are some extinction myths and facts. So myth, extinction means ignoring. Fact, extinction procedures depend on the function of the behavior. So again, very important that we're going to analyze why the student is engaging in the problem behavior. What is the function? Then that will determine what extinction procedure we use. So for example, if we determine, and as we go through each week, we're going to be learning how we determine the function by our data. If the function of behavior is to gain attention, so we found that that's the reason they're having problem behavior, is they want someone's attention, then the extinction procedure would be ignoring. Now, when we say ignoring, we don't mean we just let them engage in problem behavior. We may have to go and block them from doing something. We may have to go remove something from them. We always want to keep them safe and us safe. But when we say ignoring, we can do all those things without talking to them about the problem behavior, without verbally reprimanding the problem behavior, without giving them direct eye contact for the problem behavior. And again, this is going to be based on our data and the function, and we'll get into that. But a lot of times these kiddos will engage in this problem behavior because they want you to reprimand them. They want you to get upset. They want to have all the comments about their problem behavior and you looking at them. So again, very important to determine the function. And if the function is that they want your attention, then when we intervene, we have to be extremely careful not to give them attention for the problem behavior. So that is the extinction procedure. They're no longer going to get attention for that. Another example, if the function of behavior is to escape an aversive, for example, a demand is placed or work and the child or student wants to get out of doing that demand, the extinction procedure would be to continue to present the demand, the diversive. We continue to present the direction of, no, you need to do your math paper. If the function of behavior is determined to be that the student does the problem behavior to get something that they want, to access an item or activity, then the extinction procedure would be that we don't allow them to get it when they're behaving inappropriately. This happens a lot with our students with severe autism who really have limited communication skills, who have no way to ask for what they want. So they will engage in problem behavior to get what they want. So then the extinction procedure in that case would be if they are tantruming or they're grabbing or they're climbing for something, we don't allow access to the thing that they want. So we block that access. And then we'll get into later how we would teach them an appropriate replacement behavior, how to ask for it appropriately. But the extinction procedure would be not letting them contact it at that moment. Perfect example of this is, the classic kid in the candy store who's throwing a tantrum and the parent gives them the candy. That's positively reinforcing the tantrum. To put that on extinction, the kiddo's throwing the tantrum in the candy store and the parents don't give the candy. That's putting it on extinction. Now, you may see the tantrum increase in severity a little bit and they might engage in some new behaviors, but once they see that they're not getting the candy, then that behavior will fade and will go on extinction. And then another functional behavior could be sensory stimulation. So some of our kiddos, again, particularly students with autism, they may do some things that it's just kind of feels good to them sensory-wise. And if that is impeding their learning or hurting them in some way, we would want to block that. So we would block that sensory stimulation to put it on extinction. All right, so we've come to our last slide for this week's presentation. And like I said, this was a long one, very heavy on concepts and terminology, but an understanding of these concepts and terminology will help you through the rest of the course. So this is our last slide, and we're just going to cover some general classroom management strategies to prevent problem behavior. So antecedent strategies, those strategies that happen before the problem behavior happens to prevent it from happening in the first place. Your Tough Kid book is an excellent resource for more of these strategies. And a lot of these actually go along with some of the things you're learning in your other courses, like effective instruction, and some of your other courses that you're taking. So here are some general classroom management strategies to prevent problem behavior in your classroom. First, an organized classroom environment. So just having your instructional materials ready to go and organized is huge. That can prevent so much problem behavior in and of itself. Having a good classroom schedule that avoids downtime. If kids have downtime where they're not actively engaged with something, whether it be something that they really enjoy or, work tasks or something, they'll find ways to fill that downtime. And a lot of time it's with inappropriate things or problem behavior. So your classroom schedule needs to have smooth transitions between activities, and it just needs to avoid that downtime, and that'll avoid and prevent a lot of problem behavior. Active student responding and effective instruction is huge. Instruction that is at the appropriate level based on assessment for your students is very important. If instruction is too hard for a student, they're going to engage in problem behavior. And again, I'm sure you're learning about effective instruction in your other classes, but that it's vital to tying into preventing problem behavior as well. Evidence-based teaching methods, again, as a way to deliver effective instruction that will prevent problem behavior. And active student responding increases student engagement and, again, decreases problem behavior. So if a student is actively engaged with the teacher and with classmates and with the work, they have less time and opportunity to engage in problem behavior. And very, very important as well is giving more attention and reinforcement to positive behaviors versus inappropriate behaviors. And this is so hard for all of us to do. I struggle with this. The teachers I work with in the classrooms where I consult struggle with this. Teachers are very busy. They have so much going on. It's really hard to pay attention to all of the good things, the appropriate behaviors your students are doing, and to positively reinforce those. But I can't stress enough how vital that is. Just doing that will decrease and prevent a lot of problem behavior from happening in your classroom. We will get into more specific antecedent strategies that you will put in place in behavior plans depending on the function as we go through the course. But these are just in general, regardless of the function of problem behavior for your students, an organized classroom environment with instructional materials ready to go. a solid classroom schedule that avoids downtime, smooth transitions, active student responding, effective instruction at the student's level, and then giving more attention and reinforcement to the good behaviors versus inappropriate behaviors. All of those things will prevent problem behavior in a classroom regardless of the function. All right, so that ends our slides for week 2. And you'll see your assignments as we move along through week 2, and then we'll cover some more topics starting week 3. And again, if you have any questions at any time about anything or you need further explanation, please don't hesitate to contact me.